So welcome everyone. It's really great to see such a full house today. I'm Meredith Fluke and I'm the director of the Cantor Art Gallery. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the opening of Bringing the Holy Land Home, the Crusades, Chertsey Abbey, and the Making of a Medieval Masterpiece. This is an exhibition that has been years in the making, and we're really excited to be able to finally share it with you tonight. I will have the opportunity to say my piece when we're up the hill in the gallery, so right now I'm just here to make sure that you're aware of the schedule of events, which begins here with a lecture by our distinguished speaker, Dr. William Purkis, which we assume will conclude with a lively discussion moderated by Dr. Amanda Leister, and after which we'll move up to the Cantor Art Gallery in the new Prior Performing Arts Center to see the exhibition. The exhibition Bringing Home the Holy Land is on view at the Cantor through April 6th, and there's a full slate of programs from gallery talks to concerts to a symposium on March 25th. You can find this information on our website and on these cards, which are available here, and there's a bunch up at the gallery as well. So without further ado, I'd like to invite my colleague and guest curator for the exhibition, Dr. Amanda Leister, to the podium to kick off tonight's event.
I'm so pleased that you all could join us to celebrate the opening of Bringing the Holy Land Home. Can you hear me? Yes, good, thank you. I'd like to begin by recognizing the director of the Cantor Gallery, Dr. Meredith Fluke, my partner in this ambitious exhibition. She's been an incredible workmate, and without her, we would not have a show to open tonight. We're also lucky that so many incredible institutions and generous funders agreed to work with us. An exhibition is truly a collective endeavor. This exhibition grounds itself in a reconstruction of a set of English floor tiles and uses that reconstruction to tell us more about the people of the 13th century, their hopes and their prejudices, their desire for connection with the sacred, their conceptions of the past, and their visions for the future. We've also created a book and a website which lay out these conclusions. The space in the gallery, however, is, unlike the book and the website, inhabited by actual objects. In the Cantor, you'll be able to approach and examine real things made by hand nearly 1,000 years ago, tiles that were touched by medieval feet, sword pommels held by medieval hands, textiles that clothed medieval bodies, relics that were kissed, treasured, worn touching the skin. These medieval objects tell a story through space, and you, as you wander between them, can be part of that story. To open this exhibition, we welcome all the way from England, just like the Chertsey tiles, Dr. William Purkis, who is reader in medieval history and head of the School of History and Cultures at the University of Birmingham, UK. He is a scholar of medieval religious cultures with expertise in the history of crusading and of Latin Christian traditions of pilgrimage and monasticism. His publications include a monograph on crusading spirituality in the Holy Land in Iberia, a co-edited special issue of the journal Material Religion in the Crusading World, and a study of the acquisition and displacement to the West of holy objects originating from the 12th century Crusader states entitled Holy Christendom's New Colony, the Extraction of Sacred Matter and the Colonial Status of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem in 2020. He's worked closely with the Museum of the Order of St. John, London, for nearly a decade, and in 2017 co-curated an exhibition on Holy City, Holy War, Devotion to the Sacred in Crusader Jerusalem. He's currently completing a material history of Crusader devotion to be published by Yale University Press as Sacred Treasure, Crusaders, Relics, and the Scramble for the Holy Land. His talk for us today is entitled Bringing the Holy Land Home, Crusaders, Relics, and the transformation of Latin Christendom's sacred material world. We will take questions at the conclusion of the lecture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Purkis.
I've not worn one of these before, I'm afraid. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you this afternoon. It's a really great pleasure, a great privilege and an honour for me to speak to you to celebrate the opening of the Bringing the Holy Land Home, the Crusades, Chertsey Abbey and the reconstruction of a medieval masterpiece. So thank you so much for the invitation. From 1095 onwards, and for centuries thereafter, Latin Christians from across Western Europe were engaged in a military project to establish and maintain control of Jerusalem and the wider Holy Land region. In doing so, they were participating in a practice known to modern historians as crusading, a term derived from the fact that, as depicted in this image from the 15th century, participants wore signs of the cross on their clothing as a mark of their commitment to the undertaking, and were thus designated as cross-bearers, or as they are now generally known, Crusaders. In 1096, armies of these cross-bearers departed Western Europe for the East, and 3 years later, in July 1099, in what contemporary Latin Christians saw as nothing short of miraculous, they succeeded in conquering Jerusalem from its Muslim rulers. In the generation that followed, through a wider process of conquest and colonization, 4 Latin-ruled Crusader lordships were established on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. Working from north to south, these were the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Over the course of the 12th and 13th centuries, successive military expeditions from the west set out to reinforce or recover territory that was claimed by the rulers of these 4 Crusader lordships, normally in response to some sort of crisis in the east that was interpreted as jeopardizing Latin custody over the region. By the late 13th century, however, the crusading project had failed. The last surviving Latin-controlled territories in the Holy Land were reconquered by the forces of Mamluk Egypt in 1291, and the remaining Latin rulers of these so-called Crusader states were forced to retreat to the island of Cyprus. One of the issues that has dominated modern scholarship on the medieval crusading movement has been to consider what the principal motivations underpinning Latin Christian enthusiasm for taking the cross might have been. In the historiographical survey with which he began the 3rd edition of his general history of the Crusades, published in 2014, the British historian Jonathan Riley-Smith presented what he saw as 2 distinct modern historiographical traditions relating to this subject, the material and the devotional, which in general terms he regarded as having developed in opposition to one another. In the materialist paradigm, as he characterized it, little attention was paid to religious motivation. Historians allowed that it may have been a factor, but they found it morally repugnant and were more attracted by the idea that the settlements in Palestine, Syria, and Cyprus marked the first phase of European colonialism. The popes may have had political reasons for proclaiming crusades, and the recruits masked their desire for material advancement under a veneer of piety. Stripped of their ethic, the Crusades were being interpreted in social and economic terms by liberal as well as Marxist economic historians who were convinced that the movement constituted a turning point in the history of the European economy. Among the reasons for Riley Smith's rejection of the materialist paradigm was the fact that no compelling case based on evidence for the prevalence of the profit motive among Crusaders to the East has ever been made. Instead, he argued in a subsection of the book entitled The Challenge to Materialism that historians have turned to focus on the other forces that might have motivated Crusaders, and specifically religious faith. We have to accept, he wrote, that many men and women were prepared to sacrifice wealth, health, life itself, in a cause they believed to be just, even salvational. Their actions were individual expressions of a piety that may be alien to us, but was very real to them. As visitors to the Cantor Art Gallery over the next 3 months will find, one of the major achievements of the Bringing the Holy Land Home exhibition is to demonstrate how significant the Crusader conquest and colonization of the Holy Land was for the shaping of Western Christendom in the Central Middle Ages. More specifically, the exhibition demonstrates the impact on the West of the arrival of material culture that had originated in the Holy Land, or whose creation in the West was inspired by experiences or imaginings of the East, as is the case with the famous tiles from Chertsey, 2 of which are shown here. In this lecture, I wish to respond to and build upon some of the ideas that underpin the Bringing the Holy Land Home exhibition by suggesting that materialism may still have a part to play in understanding the ideologies and motivations of Crusaders and those who supported them, although not necessarily using the same interpretive approach taken by Riley Smith or the materialists he was responding to. By prioritizing the prospect of sacred material loss rather than the opportunity for worldly material gain, I shall try to blur the boundary line between devotional and material explanations for crusading enthusiasm. I begin by considering the centrality of material absence within the religious culture of medieval Latin Christendom, before turning to address the significance of relics as a means by which the Latin faithful might seek to mediate that absence. I will then suggest how the practice of crusading might be situated as a response to anxieties surrounding material loss and a compulsion to conserve those forms of material culture that Latin Christians valued so highly. As I hope to demonstrate, it was this compulsion to conserve that prompted a substantial displacement of relics and other holy objects from the East to the West, through which, as they saw it, medieval Latins brought the Holy Land home. At some point in the early 15th century, the Florentine artist Giovanni del Ponte was working on a program of decoration for a pair of wooden panels that were destined to serve as the doors to a tabernacle. The tabernacle was designed to display 2 emotive images when its doors were closed, both of which were located in time to the immediate aftermath of the crucifixion. For the right-hand panel, Giovanni painted a scene commonly known as the Pietà, in which the Virgin Mary cradles the dead body of her son, kissing him tenderly on the lips, as she lowers his lifeless, bloody corpse into the tomb that had been prepared for him. Meanwhile, for the panel to the left, Giovanni imagined events occurring simultaneously at the site of Christ's execution on Mount Calvary. He depicted Mary Magdalene crouching on rocky ground at the base of Christ's cross, embracing its upright shaft, her face almost touching the lowest of the nails that protrude from the wood. With bright red blood dripping all around her, emanating from the 3 nails that remain embedded in the cross, as well as from the crown of thorns that hangs poignantly over its central beam, Mary stares directly out at the viewer, drawing observers in to the drama of the events she has just witnessed. While both of Giovanni's panel paintings are highly evocative, it is easy to lose sight of how jarring his portrait of Mary Magdalene must have been to the Latin faithful of medieval Florence. For although the iconography of Mary Magdalene kneeling before the cross was commonplace in later medieval depictions of the crucifixion, in Giovanni's rendering, and in contrast with those of so many of his contemporaries, Mary is alone, with the cross looming large and empty behind her. Instead of the busy scene of torture and death with which most medieval viewers would have been familiar, and which in so many examples depicted Mary Magdalene at the foot of the cross, gazing upwards at Christ's bleeding, crucified body, often flanked by the Virgin Mary and St. John the Evangelist, and surrounded by onlookers, Giovanni's work captured a quieter moment of pathos that came after the crowds had dispersed. Here, Christ's body is gone, leaving only the detritus of his suffering and death, the cross, the nails, the crown of thorns, the blood, with a solitary, grief-stricken, and possibly even vengeful devotee left clinging onto them as surviving points of contact with the now absent God-man. For Giovanni's first-century Mary Magdalene, as was explained through the accompanying depiction of the Pietà, Christ's absence was a result of the fact that his lifeless corpse had been taken down from the cross and removed for burial in a tomb that would later be identified and celebrated as the Holy Sepulchre. Yet Mary's sense of loss would in some ways have been familiar to those Christians of 15th century Florence who contemplated her image. For Florentines of the Quattrocento, as indeed for all communities of the medieval Latin faithful, Christ's body was missing because it was believed that 3 days after his interment, he had risen from the dead and emerged from the sepulchre, before eventually departing the earthly plane altogether by ascending to heaven 40 days later. Whether or not he intended it to, Giovanni's image of Mary Magdalene thus encapsulated one of the tensions at the heart of medieval Latin Christianity's inner logic. For this was a religious culture that was centered around the accumulation and veneration of sacred presence, as was understood to be manifest in a variety of types of matter, and especially in the mortal remains of people who were deemed to be holy. But medieval Christianity was also a religious culture that was faced with an unavoidable and relentless absence because of a shared belief in Christ's resurrection and ascension, and the ensuing loss of opportunity for the faithful to see, to touch, or to kiss his body. As St. Paul summarized the situation among first-century Christians in a phrase that medieval theologians would return to time and again, although we have known Christ according to the flesh, now we know him so no longer. Consequently, It was simply not possible for the Christians of late antiquity or the Middle Ages to enjoy physical contact with their God in the same way that they might experience his martyrs and saints, whose sacred remains could be visited and venerated in the flesh at shrine centres across Latin Christendom. By way of stark contrast with pilgrimage centres such as Rome, Cologne, Canterbury and Compostela, the tomb that awaited medieval travellers to the site of Christ's burial in Jerusalem was conspicuous by its emptiness. And yet, as well as underscoring the God-man's absence, Giovanni's panel painting of Mary Magdalene also presented believers with clear signposts as to how their material urges for the divine might still be satisfied, even in a post-ascension landscape. For aside from the presence of Mary Magdalene herself, the focal point of this image is, of course, the things that Christ had left behind. One of the principal ways in which the clergy and laity of medieval Latin Christendom sought to negotiate the tensions surrounding Christ's absent body was to focus their devotional energies on a range of objects that were directly associated with his birth, life, death, and resurrection. At a theoretical level, it was believed that anything or anywhere the God-man had come into physical contact with during his brief time on earth had been infused with a kind of radioactive holy power known as virtus. It was understood to follow that as repositories of this virtus, even the most mundane things had been transformed into sites through which his presence lingered on. The sacred material culture of Christ's earthly biography thus included things associated with his infancy and childhood, such as the manger from his nativity in Bethlehem, as well as a variety of objects relating to his adult life and ministry, such as his sandals, the water pot from the wedding at Cana where he had supposedly turned water into wine, or the bench upon which he had sat at the Last Supper. Among the most prized items, however, were those associated with his passion, such as the bonds with which he had been tied up, the column where he had been flagellated, or the cloth with which he had wiped his face, known as the Veronica. More prestigious still were things that were linked with his final hours and eventual death. The nails with which he was attached to the cross, the crown of thorns with which he was humiliated, the lance that the Roman soldiers had used to pierce his side, and most substantially, the wood of the cross itself. Then there were the objects and spaces associated with his deposition, entombment, and resurrection, including most famously the Holy Sepulchre itself. This was powerful stuff, and thanks to the widely held principle of pars pro toto, the part is the whole, through which, say, a single thorn from the crown, or a splinter of wood from the cross, or a trace of stone dust from the sepulchre, all of this was understood to retain the full power of its ultimate source. And because of this, it was possible to fragment, disperse, collect, and venerate this holy matter across Latin Christendom throughout the Middle Ages. And yet, if one of the defining features of medieval Latin Christianity as a cultural system was its fundamental reliance on the material, it follows that that reliance on the material was one of its defining fragilities too. Medieval Latins knew only too well that things such as relics could be lost or stolen, and that holy places could become inaccessible, or their whereabouts even forgotten completely. Both sacred objects and holy sites could also be subjected to willful abuse and indeed intentionally destroyed. On this basis, I suggest that much of the devotional enthusiasm for crusading from the 1090s onwards should be understood as a response to anxieties surrounding the potential loss or oblivion of some of the essential and irreplaceable material means by which the Latin faithful were able to engage meaningfully with Christ's absent body. A striking illustration of these sorts of concerns can be found towards the end of one of the earliest narrative histories of the First Crusade. Here, the southern French chronicler named Raymond of Aguillet put a speech into the mouth of Al-Afdal, the vizier of Fatimid Egypt, who was seeking to annihilate the Crusaders within less than a month of their seizure of Jerusalem on the 15th of July, 1099. Having made a number of outlandish threats against his opponents, Al-Afdal was supposed to have saved his most shocking remarks for last. He turned in blasphemy against God, Raymond claimed, saying that he would destroy the Lord's birthplace and the manger where the Lord had lain, the place of the Passion and Golgotha, where it is said that blood gushed from the Lord while he was hanging on the cross, the sepulchre of the Lord's burial, and all the other holy places in the city or nearby that are venerated by Christian people. Further, he said that he would tear them up from the earth by their roots and crush them, and after this, cast the dust into the sea, so that there would no longer be any memorabilia of the Lord for the Frankish people to seek. This statement of intent was entirely imagined, but it reflects, nevertheless, how at the turn of the 12th century, some medieval Latins conceived the threat from Islam in terms of a direct and existential assault upon the materiality of their faith. And Raymond was by no means the only 12th century writer to express concerns about the Islamic threat to Christianity's material heritage in this way. In around 1121, a Parisian cleric serving in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, who had himself participated in the First Crusade, reflected on the dangers that he believed had been posed to Christ's tomb and the relic of the true cross during the original Arab conquests of the 7th century. After the death of the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, he wrote, the infidel nation oppressed the Christians of Jerusalem to the point of trying to wipe out the name of Christ and the memory of the cross and obliterating the sepulchre. And so they built a pile of wood under part of the sepulchre and set fire to it. They wanted to burn the cross in the same way. Although it had been nearly 500 years since Jerusalem had fallen to Muslim forces, a sense of historical injury clearly burned strong here. And whether referring to the actions or threats of Muslims in the 7th century or the 12th, it is clear that for both this individual and Raymond of Aguillet and others like them, the practice of crusading was regarded as a necessary response to the dangers that were believed to be presented to material culture they held to be sacred. It is striking how frequently ideas surrounding the recovery and conservation of relics recurred within the discourse of crusade recruitment in the 12th century. In around 1106, for example, efforts were being made across Italy and France by the First Crusade veteran Bohemond of Taranto to mobilize for what one chronicler subsequently referred to as the third departure of Westerners for Jerusalem. One of the key instruments of persuasion that appears to have been used to stimulate recruitment to this new expedition was a forged letter, purportedly sent to the West by the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos, through which Alexios had solicited Western military support for his besieged and beleaguered empire. Among the most remarkable features of this letter is the way that its author sought to persuade Westerners to join an expedition to the east by enumerating in detail the hoards of sacred riches that were held in the churches and treasuries of the Byzantine Empire's capital city, Constantinople. Most remarkably, the letter proposed that Latin Christians should take the city for themselves if that was the best way to protect its critical mass of holy things. It is better that you should have Constantinople than the pagans, the letter declared, because in that place they have the most precious relics of the Lord, that is to say, the pillar to which he was tied, the whip with which he was scourged, the crimson cloak in which he was dressed, the crown of thorns with which he was crowned, the reed which he held in his hands like a scepter, the clothes which were taken from him before the cross, a very large piece of the wood of the cross on which he was crucified, the nails with which he was fixed to that cross, and the linen wrappings that were found in his tomb after his resurrection. This list amounted to one of the most complete assemblies of Passion relics imaginable. But as the letter went on to describe, the sacred riches of Constantinople were by no means limited to those objects associated with Christ's punishment, execution, and resurrection. Also to be found in the imperial capital were 12 baskets of fragments from the 5 loaves and 2 fishes. In other words, the leftovers from Christ's miraculous feeding of the 5,000. The head of St. John the Baptist, complete with hair and beard, and a cornucopia of other relics or bodies of many innocents and some prophets, apostles and martyrs and confessors and virgins, which the letter's author had decided not to itemize in detail because of their sheer numbers. The implicit questions that the forged letter therefore invited Latins to ask were whether the Greeks of Byzantium were still worthy custodians of such holy things, and whether, given the apparently self-evident recent divine support for the Crusader conquest of Jerusalem, the relic collections of Constantinople were actually destined to fall into purer and more faithful hands in 1107-8. Indeed, as the letter's author put it, as if to dispel any potential ambiguity, it is more fitting for Christians than pagans to have all these. If they do have them all, it will be an important possession for the whole of Christendom. If they do not, it will be a major loss for which they will be held to account. Given the clear and present danger that the letter presented as being posed to Byzantium by the advance of the Seljuk Turks, the detailed inventory of Constantinople's relics was thus intended to remind prospective early 12th century Crusaders of the sacred material that might be gained and by extension more securely protected through a Latin conquest of Constantinople. At the same time, the letter also drew attention to the potential for a substantial relocation of that sacred material from the east to the west. As it turned out, the expedition that followed the circulation of this remarkable letter ended in a humiliating defeat, and it would be another century before Latin Christians secured control of Constantinople and its collections of relics in the wake of the Fourth Crusade. Nevertheless, there can be no question that the Crusader conquest and colonization of the Holy Land from 1099 onwards prompted the extraction and westwards displacement of sacred objects on a scale that was completely unprecedented in the history of Christianity. As Jonathan Riley Smith put it, in a framing that suggested the material and the devotional should be understood as mutually exclusive, from the winter of 1099 to 1100, veterans of the First Crusade began to reappear in Europe, bringing with them not riches, but relics. To get a sense of just how transformational the presentation of relics that had been displaced from the Holy Land could be, it is instructive to turn to northern France and to the case of a Norman warrior named Ilga Bigod. Ilga had participated in the First Crusade and had fought in the bloody conquest of Jerusalem in July 1099. According to the Latin chronicler Orderic Vitalis, within hours of the Crusaders' entrance into the Holy City on the 15th of July, Ilga was being taken on a guided tour of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre by a group of Eastern Christians who expressed their gratitude for his protection during the city's conquest by presenting him with a ball of human hair. But this was no ordinary hairball. It was, in Orderic's words, a little ball of the hair of Mary, the Holy Mother of God, and was apparently a lesser-known relic of the Passion, or so the locals claimed. After the Crusades' conclusion, Ilga returned to northern France, carrying the holy hairball with him as a prestigious trophy of his Jerusalem journey. The stories that the Christians of Jerusalem had told to encode the hairball with meaning and value had evidently travelled with him and had eventually come to the attention of the chronicler Orderic Vitalis. According to the story that Orderic had heard and then preserved for posterity, these were supposedly hairs that the Virgin had torn from her head in response to the trauma of witnessing her son being crucified. Orderic's account even included what appears to have been deemed a plausible explanation for their preservation in the 1st century. For the inviolate Virgin Mother was grieved beyond expression at the passion of Christ, her Son and Lord, and according to the ancient custom of her people and of that time, she rent her garments, tore her hair, and devoutly uttered sad lamentations at the death of her dearest one. The women who were with her, holy women who had recently become followers of the Lord, tenderly supported the weeping mother of the heavenly King and, embracing her, comforted her gently as far as was possible. They piously collected the hairs which she had torn out and carefully preserved them. John the Divine and other friends of Christ afterwards hid them in a safe place, knowing that this would provide for the salvation of many. Following his arrival in Europe in 1106, Ilga was apparently willing to share more than stories about the relic's origins. As Orderic told it, Ilga had supposedly teased his holy ball of hair into a dozen separate strands and set about gifting the individual hairs to various religious institutions across northern France, including Rouen Cathedral and the nearby Benedictine Abbey of Bec. According to Orderic, 2 of the 12 hairs had been dispatched to the Priory Church of Meaux, where they had evidently had a disruptive effect on the local religious landscape. Through the presence of these relics from the head of the Virgin, which were proudly exhibited within the church, Meaux had swiftly gained a reputation as a site of miraculous healing. As Orderic put it, many sick persons have been cured through them. Such stories of miraculous cures only enhanced the reputation of the hairs, adding yet another layer of sacred meaning and, as contemporaries saw it, providing irrefutable proof of their authenticity as powerful relics of the Passion. Similar stories might also be told with reference to early 12th century England. At around the same time that Ilga Bigod was distributing relics of the Virgin's hair across northern France, an anonymous scribe was drawing up a list of the relics held at Thorney Abbey in Cambridgeshire. The list recorded the presence of numerous objects originating from the Holy Land, including wood of the Holy Cross, fragments of stone taken from the Holy Sepulchre, Mount Calvary, the tomb of the Virgin, the site of the Ascension on the Mount of Olives, and from the place in the Judean desert where Jesus had fasted, and a piece of the table from the Last Supper. Effluvial relics were documented too, including oil of St. Catherine, which would have been taken from the monastery on Mount Sinai where her relics were venerated, and oil of St. Demetrius, no doubt extracted from the Byzantine warrior saint shrine in Thessalonica. However, it was the arrival of the relic of another Byzantine warrior saint that the monks of Thorney had documented most carefully. While the presence of the arm of St. Theodore is noted at the bottom of this relic list, it was left to the annals of Thorney Abbey, recorded in a separate manuscript, to explain how the relic had come to be there. Two items of note feature on this particular folio, which shows the years of the late 11th and early 12th centuries, and records important moments in the history of the abbey and of the wider world in which it was situated. For 1096, and with reference to the First Crusade, the annalist simply wrote, Iter Hierosolymitanus incapit. The Jerusalem journey began. And 9 years later, for 1105, the Thorney annalist went on to allude to how his abbey had profited from the expedition's success. This year, on the 11th of May, relics of the martyr Theodore were received at Thorney from a pilgrim named Everard. It's impossible to know whether Everard had also been involved in the abbey's acquisition of its other Holy Land relics, or indeed whether they had even arrived in Thorney at around the same time as the arm of St. Theodore. Either way, Thorney Abbey's collections of sacred material culture provide a clear example of the desire among medieval Latins to acquire, to displace, and to conserve relics of holy people, holy places, and holy things. But can the same be said about Chertsey Abbey, the medieval religious institution at the heart of the Bringing the Holy Land Home exhibition? Unfortunately, unlike many of medieval England's other monasteries, cathedrals, and parish churches, we know surprisingly little about the extent of Chertsey's collections of relics and other holy objects. No inventory or list of Chertsey's sacred treasures is known to have been made or has survived from any point in the Middle Ages. Nevertheless, a brief reference from the 16th century, from the time of the dissolution of the monasteries, offers a tantalizing glimpse at the range of holy matter that the monks of medieval Chertsey may have had in their custody. Through a document dating to the 29th of September, 1535, King Henry VIII's chief minister Thomas Cromwell was informed of Chertsey Abbey that, among the relics they have, as they say, the arm bone of St. Blaise, through which they give wine in cases of illness. Without further evidence coming to light, it is impossible to know for sure how, at some point before the early 16th century, an arm relic of St. Blaise had made its way to Chertsey. In hagiographical tradition, this particular saint was understood to have served as a bishop in 4th century Armenia, where he had died a martyr's death, following which his relics had proved a valuable and a desirable form of holy matter for devotees from around the late antique and medieval Christian worlds. Indeed, as this anti-clerical cartoon from early 20th century France makes clear, Blaise was a saint who was understood to get around, and whose relics were venerated in a multiplicity of shrine centres, and sometimes even in 2 or more places at once. However, it should be noted that among those holy objects looted from Constantinople and brought to the West in around 1206 by a veteran of the Fourth Crusade named Robert of Clary, were unspecified relics of the martyr St. Blaise. Around the same time, the Bishop of Soissons, one of the ecclesiastical leaders of the Fourth Crusade, presented a remarkable assembly of sacred treasures to his cathedral community in northern France. This collection included the top of the head and one of the ribs of St. Blaise. In this context, it is at least a possibility, although by no means a certainty, that the arm relic of St. Blaise in Chertsey Abbey had been presented to the monastery by a now anonymous crusader, having been acquired during the course of an expedition to the Holy Land at some point during the 12th or 13th centuries. If it is with only a great deal of caution that we might suppose a crusading provenance for Chertsey's relic of St. Blaise, we might be more confident in positing that the saint's arm was unlikely to have been the only holy object in the Abbey's collection to have originated from the East. In this regard, the 16th century document's reference to the fact that the arm of St. Blaise was numbered among other relics is disappointingly vague. Nevertheless, another surviving relic list from later medieval England provides a good sense of the sorts of objects that were held in the collections of some of the country's most prestigious religious institutions. And in the interests of full disclosure, the example I'm about to discuss I've chosen not least because the institution to which it relates is a 10-minute walk from my front door. In 1345, an inventory was taken of the relics held in Lichfield Cathedral. The document produced by this record-keeping process reveals that there was a substantial collection of sacred material culture in the heart of late medieval England that had been accumulated over centuries. And among the references to Lichfield's numerous relics of the saints, which included most famously the head, arm, and various other bones of St. Chad, the document recorded the presence of 5 lithic relics, each of which had been extracted and displaced from the Holy Land. These were a piece of the rock upon which Jesus was standing as he wept bitterly over Jerusalem, so originating from a site on the Mount of Olives. 3 fragments of stone from within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that were identified as having been extracted from Mount Calvary, Golgotha, and Christ's tomb, respectively, and a chunk of rock from the sepulchre of the Blessed Virgin, from the empty tomb within the Church of St. Mary in the Valley of Jehoshaphat. But the cathedral community of Lichfield were not just interested in lithic relics from the Holy Land, since one of their most prized sacred treasures was evidently a small cross of the wood of the Lord. This object had probably been assembled from 2 splinters that had been chipped away from a more substantial relic of the true cross and then been laid across one another to form the cross. Its particular value to the clergy of medieval Lichfield is clear from the majesty of the material surrounding in which they had enshrined it. The relic was apparently housed in the rear of a reliquary that was described as a noble cross of pure gold with a noble base of pure gold that is everywhere ornamented with precious stones and on which the image of the crucified is fixed on one side. The close attention to detail with which this reliquary cross was documented further demonstrates its significance. Various precious and highly valuable stones are fixed to it, namely 6 rubies, 5 sapphires, 15 larger emeralds, 16 large pearls, and innumerable small ones besides. Now, on the basis of this description, it's likely that the Lichfield reliquary cross resembled this object, which is now in the British Museum. It's by no means a precise match for the text, but it's about as close as I've been able to find. In the case of medieval Lichfield, then, it is clear that the arrival of material culture originating from the East had stimulated all manner of local devotional activity and artistic creativity, a tale that is also told time and again by many of the objects showcased in the Bringing the Holy Land Home exhibition. To conclude, through surveying a range of evidence from the centuries following the conclusion of the First Crusade, in this lecture I've tried to show that the arrival and circulation across the Latin West of relics originating from the East, all of which were understood to be charged with holy power, had a transformational impact on Latin Christendom's sacred material world. Furthermore, in reflecting on the motivations for participation in the crusading movement more generally, I have suggested that if one focuses attention on sacred riches rather than their profane counterparts, there can be no question that Latin Christians did indeed profit in material terms from their participation in or their support for the conquest and colonization of the Holy Land. On this basis, I argue that materialism should still be regarded as central to the matrix of ideas associated with crusade enthusiasm, both in terms of the desire to acquire and conserve holy matter, and in terms of the broader anxieties surrounding material absence and material loss that were crucial to the thought worlds of Latin Christians more generally. Whether or not Chertsey Abbey itself profited directly from the influx of sacred stuff that followed the Crusader conquest and colonization of the Holy Land in the early 12th century is impossible to say. But if the Chertsey monk's arm relic of St. Blaise was indeed accompanied by the same sorts of Holy Land relics that are known to have been in widespread circulation across the West and was certainly present in the relic collections of Thorney and Lichfield, then the pavement of the Abbey's chapter house and its celebration of Latin Christendom's crusading heroics could hardly have provided a more appropriate artistic framing for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Purkis. So, Dr. Purkis is willing to take questions. I wonder what questions the audience would like to ask. Yes, Virginia.
This was absolutely fabulous. She knows what a thrill this is for me to see all these objects. They're absolutely marvelous and you present them in such a coherent way. I was just thinking that for this audience, it might be important to mention Egeria. And that from the time of Constantine, so this is much later, we're talking several centuries later, you're talking about the Holy Land. But from the time of Constantine and the founding of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, we have documentation of people seeking and the relic of the true cross being presented. And you're speaking of all the splinters. It is not unreasonable at all to actually believe that perhaps that massive, that amount of work is being described in this pilgrimage from a wealthy woman from the Iberian Peninsula. That small fragments from there could easily have been chipped off and duplicated. In fact, there was even, I think, a reference that people were careful to make sure that when someone came to kiss the relic, they couldn't bite off and therefore have this with them. So this materiality we're speaking about is not something that comes later. It was absolutely inherent, really, in early practice. So that, of course, we see it with such detail. You have to say, there's earlier, much more generic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think thinking about the way that the matter that was acquired, you're absolutely right, of course, that the traditions that I'm talking about date back to the much earlier period, from the 4th century onwards. What's clear in the 12th century is they are turbocharged, and there is clearly efforts are being made to revive the ways in which, in the late antique period, in the Byzantine period, there was certainly objects circulating, particularly circulating among elites, but also you'll see when you visit the exhibition an example of a pilgrim ampulla, a small flask, designed for everybody who went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land to return with some sort of trace element, be it dirt, dust, water, oil. That process is rebooted in the 12th century. It's been dormant for centuries, but they really go big on seeking to enable pilgrims to the Holy Land of all statuses. So it's not just elites, but seeking to enable them to return to the West with fragments of the Holy. And you mentioned there the idea of pilgrims, seeking to smuggle a bit of the true cross out, having kissed it and so on. What's also interesting is clearly pilgrims of the 12th century are trying to do that as well, and the newly installed Latin authorities in Jerusalem quickly become concerned to try to control that sort of behavior. So they put covers over the Holy Sepulchre. They put covers over the rock at the heart of the Dome of the Rock, which they understand to be the Templum Domini, the Lord's Temple. But at the same time, they're also seeking to facilitate the extraction. So they're not trying to suppress it so much as to control it. And I think that's what the revival of the industry for manufacturing pilgrim flasks, pilgrim ampullae, is designed to do, is that they can, whether they're gifting them, whether they're selling them, whatever they're doing, but they are seeking to make sure that they're controlling the supply in that way.
Thank you. Other questions? Sean?
So I wanted to follow up on Virginia's question, which is, since we do have a very long 6th century by 1095, of, I don't know what to call it, a noumenal economy, I guess, an economy of devotion that has to do with objects. I'm curious about, so you're talking about this supercharging or sort of picking up something, and I'm curious about whether, to what degree are we just seeing the continuation of that sort of economic model, if we want to call it that, the economic model of the relic and what roles it can perform and its sort of fungible place within politics and other things. To what degree is that old model still continuing? It's just being picked up on and re-energized, and to what degree in the 12th and 13th centuries are we creating a new model of ritual value to these objects? Because there is clearly a really strong one in the Carolingian and Ottonian period, and there's a lot of circulation of objects from Italy and from the Byzantine world into Western Europe. So are we just looking at sort of a recapitulation of something that's centuries old, or are we looking at actual the creation of new, and I'm calling them economic models advisedly here, but I think it's helpful just to kind of make the connection back to Riley Smith and this notion of the materialist turn?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great question. I hope it's not a cop-out when I say I think it's both. I think we're seeing, on the one hand, the revival of practices that are clearly evident from both textual and material evidence from the Byzantine period. So the creation of pilgrim flasks being the most obvious thing to point to. But the archaeological evidence for the intervening period between the Byzantine period and the Crusader period indicates that there is no tradition of that sort of object being manufactured for circulation to the widest possible social spectrum of pilgrims. So I think in that intervening period, elites are still able to engage in that economy of the sacred. And, legends about Charlemagne going to the Holy Land and acquiring relics and then distributing to the West, that's clearly continuing. And the Byzantine emperors in particular are Constantinople as a focal point for the distribution to the West of sacred objects. That's well documented in a very important study by Holger Klein about that subject. But what I think is distinctive about the 12th century is Latin Christians control supply in a way that hasn't been the case ever before. Obviously, Christians have been in control of it before the Islamic period, but Latin Christians in the 12th century are controlling the supply of relics. So at one level, it means that ecclesiastical authorities, or ecclesiastical and secular authorities in the Kingdom of Jerusalem are able to do things, or they're able to inherit and inhabit the role that had previously been played by the Byzantine emperors of distributing substantial relics and reliquaries to the West as a means of forging solidarities with their counterparts in Western Europe, and creating a kind of expectation of reciprocal support for their crusading project to maintain the hold over those holy places. But what is distinctive, I think, about the 12th century is the fact that there is a proliferation of forms of distribution of sacred matter that enable all visitors to the Holy Land, regardless of social status, to acquire something and then take it back to the West. And I think that's part of, to put it kind of crudely, it's part of the Holy Land package. Part of the raison d'etre of the Kingdom of Jerusalem is to maintain custody of the sacred, but it's to enable Latin Christians to access the sacred, all Latin Christians, and that extends to providing welfare for them through the Order of the Hospital of St. John when they arrive, but it also extends to providing them with souvenirs of their journey to take back to the West. So, to cut a long answer short, both and.
Yes, and I guess I'd ask you to move to the microphone. Sure. Thank you.
Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I have actually a very basic question. Could you speak a little towards to the demographic of who actually went on these Crusader expeditions? One envisions that, or from history classes and so on, I always imagine military soldiers, but did actually members of their family accompany them? Male members? Did women go? Who actually was this demographic? Thank you so much.
No, thank you. It's a really great question. In the period before 1187, expeditions to the Holy Land from the First Crusade onwards would involve quite wide cross-sections of society. So, yes, there were senior aristocrats who would travel, sometimes with their families, with their entourage, and a wide group of members of kin. I mean, one of the striking things, particularly about Riley Smith's work on the sort of the participation in the First Crusade, is how closely knit in terms of kinship members of the first participants in the First Crusade were. And that continues into the 12th century. By the time of the expedition of the 1140s, known as the Second Crusade, we've got the King of France participating and many senior aristocrats from France. But interestingly, many senior aristocrats whose predecessors, whose fathers, grandfathers, uncles, sometimes whose fathers-in-law had been on crusade. So there's a family tradition of crusading builds up in certain sections of the Western aristocracy. But we shouldn't just think about aristocracy and elites participating in crusades, because what's clear is from the First Crusade onwards, crusades also attracted a much broader cross-section of society. So people of lower socioeconomic backgrounds participating, and often they are the ones that are complained about by the chroniclers because they're the ones that slow things down. They're not regarded as being terribly helpful for actually the fighting bit of the expeditions. But then things change after 1187 with the Third Crusade. And one of the things, and you'll see this in the map in the expedition, one of the things that changes in 1187 is how people travel to the Holy Land. So between 1096 and 1187, crusading is fundamentally an overland undertaking. So you cross through France, down and then through to Constantinople, across Asia Minor, and then down through northern Syria into Palestine. So it's difficult to control who is attached to those kind of armies when they're overland. From 1187 onwards, naval forces come into operation. Again, this is what you see this in Amanda's the map that accompanies the exhibition. And Norman Housley talks about the professionalization of crusading from 1187 onwards, that from this point there are restrictions on participation. Or to see it another way, people who wish to go on crusade but can't fight are encouraged to contribute to the crusading cause in other ways. That can include making financial contributions to crusading, making liturgical contributions to crusading. And this is a particular, you mentioned women. Women are particularly encouraged that the way that they can contribute, particularly in the early 13th century, is through prayer and procession, channeling penitential effort towards the liturgical and devotional support for crusading.
So this has been a wonderful discussion. We have time for maybe one more question. Is there one more question? Yeah. That's you. And after this question, let me just remind us all that we're going to head up the hill and see the amazingness and all its glory, and we can continue our conversation there.
And I don't want to hold that up. I just want to say thank you. This is absolutely excellent. And your focus on materiality seems spot on, and led me to a question about the relationship between these holy relics on one hand and the role of the Blessed Sacrament. So you made this really interesting comment about this sort of lack of access to the God-man. And one of the primary images that you began with was, of course, a frontal for a tabernacle, right? So I'm very curious about, in essence, the theology that we might, wrap together of these two encounters with the materiality of the presence of Christ, we might say, in the eyes of a Latin Christian. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And you're absolutely right. So the images I started with of the 15th century Florentine are the images of the doors to a tabernacle, which, when opened, would have contained the Eucharist. And that's one of the ways I'm actually, so teaser trailer for the book, sorry for the horrible self-promotion, but I'm starting with that image in the book, and I'll close at the end by talking about the development of Eucharistic piety from the 13th century onwards. But the chronology there is so crucial, because Eucharistic piety, Festival of Corpus Christi, and so on, is it's a 13th century. So I think why crusading occurs, or among the reasons that crusading occurs at the historical moment it does, is because there isn't yet that widespread devotion to Corpus Christi in quite the same way that there is in the later period. And during the course of the research, led me to another question. Why is it that in 1095, 1096, Latin Christians are so concerned to possess the Holy Land? And why is it that after 1291, we are not seeing the whole resources of the Latin West pulling together to recover? And I think it's because the devotional urgency to possess the holy places is the same in the late 13th, early 14th century. And among the reasons for that is the arrival and proliferation and widespread veneration of the host, the Eucharistic piety, but also, of course, it's a product of everything that I've been talking about this afternoon, the movement of the sacred from the east to the west. So it has been conserved, it has been safeguarded, it is now accessible across the Latin West in a way that it wasn't felt to be in the late 11th century. Now, that's not to say that in the later medieval centuries, Latin Christians aren't still interested in visiting the Holy Land. I mean, the practice of pilgrimage still continues in the later medieval centuries, of course. The practice of crusading still continues, but it continues in Iberia, in the Baltic. Crusading evolves, I think. The idea of crusading evolves into much more of an internalized, it's about self-sacrifice, it's about subjecting the individual to Christomimetic violence, or an undertaking in Christomimetic violence of the body. And that doesn't really matter where you do that. You don't have to do it in the Holy Land. You can do it anywhere where your body is going to be under threat. So, I think it's a wonderful question to have been asked of which to conclude. So thank you so much. But I think it is all wrapped up with that issues of the Eucharist and how Latin Christendom, Western Christendom, has been transformed as a result of this displacement of sacred objects that I've been describing. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.